There's a moment where Abraham Lincoln, worn down past the point most people associate with him, sent a message to his own general that read, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." Read that again. The President of the United States, mid-war, joking that he might just take the army back himself because the man he gave it to wouldn't use it. That's not a rumor or a punchline invented later. That's where this story actually starts, not with a battle, but with a president who had simply run out of patience. George McClellan didn't earn his way into command through some long, grinding climb. He got there fast, almost too fast for his own good. Early in the war, he led Union troops through small fights in the mountains of Western Virginia, and while most of the real tactical credit belonged to a subordinate officer who later complained loudly that he'd gotten none of it, McClellan's name was the one that ended up in the papers. The New York Herald called him the Napoleon of the present war. He liked that. He believed it too, if his own letters are anything to go by. Then Bull Run happened. The Union's first real battle turned into a disorganized retreat, soldiers and panicked civilians streaming back into Washington, and the capital needed someone to look like a savior. McClellan got the call. His train ride into the city was practically a parade. People had already decided, before he'd proven a single thing in that role, that he was the man who'd win this war for them. What he found in Washington was chaos, soldiers with no real structure, no defense worth the name. And here's the part nobody disputes, not even his harshest critics. He fixed that. He drilled the men. He built supply lines that actually worked. He rode out constantly to review the troops, and they loved him for it, genuinely, the way soldiers love someone who finally feeds and clothes them properly. He built nearly 50 forts around Washington and armed them. Within months, he commanded over 100,000 men, the best equipped army the country had ever put together. They called him Little Mac. That nickname carried real affection, not sarcasm. But there's a difference between building an army and using one, and that difference is the whole story of George McClellan. Lincoln spent the back half of 1861 pushing him to move against Confederate forces sitting near Manassas. McClellan wouldn't go. He kept citing enemy numbers that were wildly inflated, fed to him by scouts and hired detectives who weren't exactly skeptical of their own sources, and he kept his actual plans to himself, telling almost no one in the cabinet what he intended to do or when. When he came down with typhoid that December, Lincoln got so frustrated he started holding strategy meetings directly with McClellan's subordinates, going around his own general entirely. That's not a normal working relationship. That's a president who no longer trusted the man in charge.
So when McClellan finally produced a plan in early 1862, it wasn't to fight the army Lincoln wanted him to fight. It was to load the entire force onto ships, sail down to the Virginia coast, and march on Richmond from the side, skipping the confrontation near Washington altogether. Lincoln didn't like it. It left the capital exposed, and it depended on McClellan moving with speed and aggression, two things he'd shown zero evidence of possessing. Lincoln approved it anyway because at that point, any plan that actually produced movement looked better than another season of nothing. What happened next at Yorktown tells you everything you need to know about how McClellan operated. The Confederate general defending that position had maybe a tenth of the troops needed to hold it, so he bluffed, marched the same small group of soldiers back and forth in plain sight, fired cannons at staggered intervals, made a skeleton force look like a real army. A more aggressive commander tests that kind of bluff in an afternoon, sends a probing attack, finds out in hours that the line is hollow. McClellan didn't test it at all. He sat outside that town for nearly a month, calling up heavy siege guns for a fight that didn't need to happen, while actual Confederate reinforcements arrived by train and slowly turned his imagined threat into a real one. The siege he'd planned to break an empty line ended up giving his enemy exactly the time it needed to stop being empty. When his men finally moved in, they found logs painted black propped up to look like cannons. Congress was furious. A resolution to remove him failed by a procedural technicality, not because anyone made a real case for keeping him. It's worth sitting with how much the men under him actually loved him during all of this, because it makes everything that follows harder to wave away as simple cowardice. McClellan rode the lines constantly, learned faces, learned names, made soldiers feel like more than numbers on a muster roll. Years later, veterans who'd watched him fail to press advantage after advantage still spoke about him with something close to reverence. That kind of loyalty doesn't usually attach itself to a fraud. It attaches itself to a man who was extraordinary at one half of command and seemingly unable to perform the other half when it actually counted. Then Robert E. Lee took command of the army in front of him, and everything got worse fast. Lee attacked on June 26th, and for the better part of a week, the two armies tore into each other in a string of battles that have never really left the history books. Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Savage Station, Glendale, and finally Malvern Hill. At Gaines Mill, Lee threw nearly 60,000 men at a Union corps a third that size and broke it in the largest single Confederate attack of the entire war. McClellan had men south of the river that day who outnumbered the Confederates facing them more than 2-1, and he never sent them in. He left his army without a clear chain of command during the retreat that followed, simply moved south himself and let his corps commanders figure out the rest. By July 1st, his army made its stand at Malvern Hill, and there, for once, the math actually worked in his favor. Confederate troops walked into open ground against Union artillery and were slaughtered. 5,000 casualties in an afternoon in attacks so badly coordinated that one of Lee's own generals said flatly afterward, it was not war, it was murder. McClellan had just won, clearly and unambiguously, on a battlefield his own artillery dominated. His officers urged him to push forward. He retreated anyway, down to a base on the James River, ceding ground he'd just defended successfully. Richmond, which had been close enough to see, wasn't anymore. Lincoln, watching all this from Washington, put it about as plainly as a president ever has. It seemed unreasonable, he wrote, that a string of successes spread across half a year could help the Union so little, while a single setback could hurt it so much. He wasn't wrong about who that line was aimed at.
Then something happened that doesn't happen in real wars, except this one time it did. In September, 2 Union soldiers stumbled on a packet of papers wrapped around some cigars, dropped in a field by a careless Confederate courier. It was Robert E. Lee's actual battle plan, his whole army's movements laid out in writing, revealing that he'd split his forces into scattered pieces. McClellan held his enemy's entire strategy in his own hands. He told an aide that if he couldn't beat Lee now, he'd go home. And then, and this is the part historians still argue about, down to the exact hour, he waited. By the time his army actually engaged at Antietam Creek a few days later, Lee had been given enough time to pull his scattered forces back together. The single greatest piece of battlefield intelligence in the entire war produced, instead of a knockout, the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, and even by the account of people who like McClellan, the battle itself was a draw at best. Lee retreated across the river afterward, which let the Union call it a win on paper. McClellan had the blueprint for total victory 2 days before that battle started. What he actually delivered was a bloodbath that settled nothing. It was just enough, barely, for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation days later, a decision that had everything to do with the timing McClellan's hesitation created, and nothing to do with anything McClellan wanted. He was furious about it privately. He didn't believe in a war fought to end slavery. He wanted the Union restored exactly as it had been. Lincoln went out to visit him at his camp not long after, and according to McClellan's own retelling, told him his only real flaw was wanting everything perfectly ready before he acted. Lincoln meant that as a warning. McClellan apparently took it as a compliment. Within days, Lincoln ordered him to advance. He didn't. He blamed his horses, he blamed his supplies, he blamed a railroad spur that hadn't been repaired to his liking. Lincoln's patience, which had survived the peninsula and survived the agonizing wait before Antietam, finally ran out that fall. In October, he sent McClellan the longest letter he ever wrote to anyone, picking apart every excuse point by point. If Lee's army could move through the same exhausted country, why couldn't his, with every advantage on his side? He wrote, almost pleading, "I say try. If we never try, we shall never succeed." 2 weeks after that, McClellan sent in a report claiming his cavalry horses were too worn out to keep working. Lincoln's reply is one of the driest comebacks in presidential history. He asked what exactly the horses had been doing since Antietam that could have tired them out this badly. McClellan took it as a personal insult and wrote back a long defensive list of cavalry activity, missing the actual point completely. An army sitting still for a month while the war dragged toward winter wasn't being held back by its horses, it was being held back by him.
The midterm elections came in early November, and Republicans lost ground, in part because the war didn't feel like it was being won even after Antietam. The very next day, Lincoln signed the order removing McClellan from command. Not because he lost a battle, he hadn't. Not because of some single disaster that cost the Union ground it couldn't get back. He lost his job because of what he failed to do with everything he'd been handed. The biggest, best-trained army the country had ever fielded, and at one unbelievable moment, his enemy's own battle plan dropped directly into his lap. He left his headquarters in November to soldiers who genuinely cheered him on his way out, men who didn't care about strategy debates and only knew that the general who'd trained and fed them was leaving. He never commanded troops in the field again. He spent the next 2 years trying to win an argument he'd already lost. He testified to Congress in 1863, blaming withheld reinforcements and political sabotage for everything that went wrong on the peninsula. Then, in 1864, his own political party did something almost nobody saw coming. They nominated him for president, putting a general Lincoln had personally fired on a ballot directly against the man who fired him. For a few months, it looked like it might actually work. The war was dragging, casualties were climbing, and a tired North was genuinely open to a candidate promising an end to it. McClellan campaigned the way he'd commanded, cautiously, hedging, trying to please factions of his own party that didn't agree with each other. He ran on a platform calling for negotiated peace with the Confederacy, a position he didn't fully believe in himself, and that contradiction showed every time he opened his mouth about it. He spent real effort specifically trying to win over the soldier vote, the men actually serving in the army he used to command, hoping the old affection would translate into ballots. Then Atlanta fell to Sherman that September. The war suddenly looked winnable again, and the bottom dropped out of his campaign almost overnight. When the votes were counted, Lincoln won in a landslide, 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. It wasn't close. Even many of the soldiers he'd commanded, the men who'd cheered him on his way out of Warrenton 2 years earlier, voted for the president who fired him over the general who'd led them. The country had been given a direct choice between the two men, and it chose, decisively, the one who'd done the firing. He spent the rest of his life writing and rewriting the story of his own command, convinced that history would eventually take his side over the people who doubted him. It hasn't. And the reason isn't that he was a coward or a fraud. The men who served under him never said that, and they had no reason to lie about how he treated them. The reason is simpler and harder to forgive. He took nothing and built the most capable army the nation had ever seen. He was handed every advantage a commander could ask for, including once his enemy's own battle plan dropped directly into his hands by pure accident. And every single time the moment came to spend what he'd built, he chose not to. He never lost his army. He just never used it for the one thing it existed to do. And in the only war that ever mattered to his name, that turned out to be exactly the same as losing.